Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise to this motion today, and had occasion to reflect on it a bit this morning in a particular context. I had the honour for the third time since being elected of representing the NDP at the National Prayer Breakfast. And in the Prayer for Canada and the Nations offered up by the Right Honourable Chief Justice Richard Wagner, we were reminded this morning of a call to people of faith within the Christian community to be good shepherds of the planet and the environment, and that our duties extend beyond concern for our own souls, as it were, Madam Speaker, and extend to the people that we share the planet with and to the planet itself. And I think it's an important reminder in this debate, and certainly financial implications are an important part of this question and any policy. But it was an important reminder that we have duties that extend beyond our pocketbook, Madam Speaker, and I think our duty to the planet certainly is one of those. But I also think we're fortunate in that there are a lot of solutions that we can implement in order to do our part to help save the planet and the people on it. And there's a lot of evidence that climate change is real, it's happening, there are real consequences from a practical point of view in terms of costs, and they're projected to get worse. One of those policies that we can implement is a price on carbon, and we can have a debate about where exactly to put that price and everything else. I think the Conservatives have raised important points that we're sensitive to in the NDP about the cost to low-income households in Canada. But I find it odd that that would be a reason to not do anything when it comes to climate change. And absent in their comments today are real alternatives to still take meaningful action on climate change. NDP governments have shown, and my colleague from BC just rightly pointed out, both in BC and in Alberta, what can accompany carbon pricing is a rebate program. Not unlike the way that we offer a rebate to low-income families on the GST, we can provide a rebate in order to try and help families that are struggling with that additional cost, and that allows us to secure the benefit of a carbon tax for the environment, while at the same time responding to legitimate concerns of low-income households, whether they're pensioners on fixed incomes, or single-parent families, or families with two parents who are trying to hold down, in some cases, more than one job, but are just having a hard time making ends meet. Sometimes because of the cost of childcare, or the cost of housing, or the cost of prescription drugs, or the fact that that real wages haven't been rising to keep pace with the costs of the things that people need in order to be able to secure for them and their families a reasonable standard of life. So I really think it's important for Canadians at home to resist the temptation of the dichotomy that Conservatives are presenting today, that somehow it's either not really doing anything when it comes to climate change in the face of a real large and mounting amount of evidence to say that something is happening on the planet that's different, and we're seeing some of the consequences of that, simply because there are cost pressures on Canadian families. There's all sorts of ways to try and address those cost pressures directly when we talk about a price on carbon, by having some sort of meaningful rebate system. And that's where I think it would be important for the federal government here to try and work with provinces where that doesn't exist to try and make that happen. I think it's unfortunate it will be unfortunate if the federal government's position continues to be simply that it's just up to each province on their own, because they have undertaken to implement this price on carbon. I think they also need to be just as involved with the provinces when it comes to the question of how to ensure fairness for low-income families. But there's ways of doing that without sacrificing the very idea of a price on carbon. But more broadly, I would say I would welcome Conservatives to the club of people that are concerned about costs for Canadian families and question why it is. I mean, we don't hear MPs, on either side, not in the last election and not since, talk about the fact that the Canadian corporate income tax went from 28% in the year 2000 to just 15% today. And people wonder why Canadian families are struggling. That money used to go to help fund programs and initiatives that made life more affordable for Canadians. So when that income disappeared, that made a meaningful difference. It was around that time, it started a little earlier in 1995, that the federal government, for instance, got out of funding new affordable housing. Now we're starting to see a bit of a return to that. And certainly, any kind of federal investment is welcome. There's more to do, but the idea that somehow that we have to be constrained, partly I was listening to the Conservative member for York Simcoe talking about the cost pressures on Canadian families as if it was simply taxes that made it impossible for Canadian families to get ahead. But the reality is that actually a steep reduction in corporate income taxes and the hollowing out of government revenue to be able to support investments in new affordable housing or to be able to sponsor a new national childcare program that made childcare available and affordable for Canadian families that want to go to work and support their families, or the rating of the EI fund that successive Liberal and Conservative governments engaged in the lack of meaningful reform to the EI program since the new government was elected, the lack of leadership from successive Liberal and Conservative governments on establishing a national pharmacare plan, and in fact entrenching in new trade deals, and they're doing this still in CETA and in TPP, the intellectual property rights of pharmaceutical companies that are milking Canadians who are beholden to them because of the state of their health. Those are all ways that we could help affordability for Canadians. And those pressures, cost pressures, have come at a time when actually we've seen significant reductions in tax for Canadian businesses, and particularly the largest corporations. We don't hear from them saying, let's close the CEO stock option loophole in order to find ways to make life more affordable for Canadians, to help fund a rebate on the carbon tax, although that would produce its own revenue in order to be able to do that, but to invest in childcare or to invest in new housing. These are all options. So we take the point about affordability, but asking Canadians to continue to make do in an economy that hasn't been good to them, where Canadian household debt is at record levels because people aren't making enough at work in order to be able to afford the very things that you need. I mean, you see ads on television about a Canadian family where they're concerned because they've got a dentist bill and they've got a car repair, and the answer suggested to them by financial institutions in those ads is to get a loan. And the financial institution says, hey, isn't it great? Yeah, you're strapped and your credit cards are maxed out, and don't worry, we're here for you. We'll give you another loan. Canadians aren't going to be able to overcome the cost pressures that exist for them on their own. That's why we need collective solutions. That's why on these benches here we continue to talk about a collective solution to the cost and the availability of childcare. It's why we talk about a collective solution to the cost of prescription drugs. It's why we talk about collective solutions to the lack of affordable housing, because we know that those are the things that are going to help relieve those real cost pressures on Canadians. And in order to accomplish those things, the largest Canadian corporations are going to have to pay their fair share. And the fact of the matter is, they're not doing that. They're paying almost half as much as they did just 15, 16 years ago, Madam Speaker. And so it's no wonder why those cost pressures have been mounting. And it's no wonder why Canadian households have been going further and further into personal debt in order to cover those costs. That's the money that was in place when we had a fair corporate tax rate in Canada. And Canadians are beginning to shoulder the burden of that debt on themselves. So we don't have to pit the environment against the affordability of Canadians. We can work together to make life more affordable for Canadians, and we can do it while observing our sacred obligation to be good shepherds of the earth, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you very much, and I listened with great interest to the all-of-government approach that the NDP is I think shares with us, that fighting climate change is something you do not just in terms of putting a price on pollution. It's also how you build cities. It's how you support farmers. It's how you support low-income Canadians, people in the north who have different energy consumption patterns than people in the south. And we need to do everything we can. And the member's opposite referenced Australia, which had a carbon tax, and then a government very similar to Stephen Harper's, in fact I think they were very good friends, came along and took it off. The price of petrol, as they call it in Australia, right now is at $1.41 a litre in Sydney. I just checked. My cousin works with an oil industry over there, and so I gave him a call, and one of his jobs is to go and check the retail price. And I said, when the carbon tax came off the price of petrol, what happened to the price of gas? He said it went up. He said the companies filled the gap. In other words, the consumer didn't get the difference, the corporation did. And the price of gas in Australia, even without a carbon tax, in Sydney to Toronto, is higher in Sydney than it is in Toronto. I wonder if the member opposite would like to comment.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton, Transcona.
Well, I thank the member very much for his thoughts and the opportunity to comment on that. Because I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, Canadians themselves, from their own experience, will know that the price of gas fluctuates all the time for all sorts of reasons. It never seems to fluctuate down quite as much as it fluctuates up, and it's usually not very clear why it fluctuates up. I would say that's one of the reasons why I think my colleague from Windsor West has such a great idea to establish a commission and an ombudsman that would actually have the responsibility of overseeing gas prices in Canada, looking at them to try and understand it, to actually have some powers to be able to get the information it needs to understand where gas prices are going and why, and to be able to do something about it so that Canadians can be assured of a fair price at the pumps. The idea that somehow a carbon tax is like suddenly going to make gas pricing unfair in Canada, as if it had been up to now, is just ridiculous.
Reprise, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Bellechasse et Etchemin-Lévis.
The honourable member for Bellechasse, les Etchemin-Lévis.
Colleague thinks of this liberal tax grab. They've already lost control of the debt. They've increased taxes on the Canadian, and they also have no control on our greenhouse emission. They refuse to tell us what will be this impact of this tax. So why is he trusting the Liberal, if he does, to take more money from the pocket of Canadian without any result, real result? Because I'm sure, as us, he wants real result for the environment.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I think I've been very clear on the record that I support a price on carbon, first of all. But second of all, that I don't think that means that you wouldn't be interested in having the information about what government projects that will cost Canadians. If you go to the Alberta government website, they do actually have a projected cost per Albertan each year. It's part of how you calculate the rebate, which helps low-income Albertans deal with that cost. But I've said also on the record that I think that the Conservative ask simply for the cost of the tax is only half the question, and that I think if they were interested in a real informed debate, they would also be asking for pricing on what the cost of not doing anything on climate change is to Canadians as well, and if they could please just suggest some alternatives, some real meaningful alternatives for how to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, then we could ask for the costing on that too. And then we could have a real and informed debate. So supporting a price on carbon doesn't mean supporting the government's secrecy about this. I think Alberta's shown that you can be open and transparent, but it feels politically motivated when they just ask for the one side of the equation. And I think if they're sincere in their desire to have a meaningful, well-informed debate, that has to include costing the price of doing nothing, as well as other meaningful alternatives for reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Resuming debate.